various other places have seen sort of reduced wildlife, and because of the fact that we're constantly cutting down forests, changing uses of land, and expanding our cities, we end up having to create heat islands. It's getting hotter in the city, but the more you go outside, it's getting cooler and cooler. And why is that? Because of the fact that, well, concrete is just not a good material in the way that it conducts and reflects heat, and it traps heat in urban islands. So we all experience this in very different ways. Today, everybody's talking about climate change and sustainability, and everybody knows that the world is increasing in temperature, but we're not necessarily seeing that. Some places are getting colder, some places are getting warmer. I mean, our seasons are changing. We're getting a lot more rain than we used to, sometimes no rain at all. And this is something that affects us across the world, and it affects us at our local levels as well. So I wanted to take this opportunity to really share with you what really does it mean when we say climate change, and how can we sort of look at this big bad wolf in the world and understand what it means to us at a personal level and at a local, more contextual level. So the first thing I want to start with is that there are many myths around climate change. So we've all heard that, climate change is natural, that carbon emissions are, increasing, and there's a lot more that's happening. It's too late to do things. So these are the three big sort of themes that I hear from a lot of people every time I talk to them. And I wanted to sort of go over each one of them and share a few facts or thoughts, right? And a few pieces of evidence with you to say that, well, the climate does indeed change naturally, but we are responsible for a lot of the more rapid climate change that's been happening over the last 40 or so years. And so I'll start with this big piece around carbon, right? There's this theory right now that goes around called carbon tunnel vision, where essentially everybody's focused just on carbon, but then you forget about all the other impacts, right? About biodiversity loss, about shrinking ice sheets, about droughts, about extreme heat events, about many other climate events that we hear about, we see, we experience, but we don't necessarily understand how they're related to us. Emissions indeed is a big factor. And so that's why I think looking at it from just a carbon perspective is important. It's a good indicator, but it's not the only one, right? Methane emissions, for instance, someone just put in the chat, is a big part of it as well. And right now, just to give you a sense of where we're at, temperatures today have been, I think, recorded at 1.1 degrees Celsius, warmer than about what it was 40 years ago. And this kind of fluctuation has not happened over the last maybe 800,000 years or so in the Earth's history. And to put that in context, the planet and, well, the Earth is about 4.56 billion years old. If you think about our time on this planet, it's a small piece of that time. And in that small amount of time, we've been able to change a lot of this planet's face. We've been able to sort of create a lot of deforestation. We've been able to increase sea level across the world. We've been able to remove ice caps from both the poles. It's a bit tremendous, and it's also, I see it as a double-edged sword in terms of seeing the human potential that we've been able to do this. And at the same time, what else could we do to fix everything that we've done, right? So to say that, I then move on to the fact that climate change is indeed natural. So if you look at the Earth's history, temperatures have indeed been changing. We've been through periods of ice ages, we've been through periods of warm, extreme heat, tumultuous sort of geological events across sort of those 4.56 billion years. But just in the time that we've had the Industrial Revolution of about 200 years or so, and especially in the last 50 years, the climate has changed radically. It's changed in ways that we didn't anticipate. And just in 2023, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the foremost authority around the world on climate change and hosts, the COP events around the world every year, soon to happen in Dubai, actually, in a couple of weeks, said that we are on a really dangerous track. just in the last, I think, 40 years, we've increased sort of our temperature to 1.1 degrees, closer and closer to the 1.5 degrees accord that was set in 2015 at the Paris Agreement between governments to limit climate change and increase temperatures to 1.5 degrees. We are seeing more than 279 billion tons of ice being lost almost, over the course of 10, 20 years in places like Greenland and in the Northern Pole. It's really something to think about. But I think, with all of this doom and gloom and all the narrative around doom and gloom, that we will not be able to survive, that the Earth's face is changing, that we will all sort of live in cities on the coast that will essentially be, become islands at some point due to sea level rises, there's still hope. So I want to leave you on this slide with the fact that while it's all doom and gloom, and there are a lot of different sort of pieces of misinformation and evidence going around, it's not too late. And we still have the power and the ability to change things. And that's where it becomes important to talk about what it means really to enable climate action, right? And to enable an understanding of what it means to be in a space where climate change is happening. So I'll sort of start off by telling you that climate change does have global effects, right? All of this sort of talk around increased carbon emissions, increasing temperature. I mean, 1.5 degrees is not that much. Every day, the temperature changes, here and there. But when you say 1.5 degrees or 1.1 degrees, as the current stock take says, it actually means that on average around the world, our temperatures have increased by 1.1. So if today the temperature was 10 degrees on average, because of climate change, it's become 11.1 degrees. And that has major, major consequences on biodiversity. You'll see loss of wildlife, you'll see changes in weather patterns, and you might notice this yourself, right? And this is where I think we experience climate change in different ways when we think about our own local environment and context. So just in India, if you think about it, even in every state, it's different. Weather patterns change so much that crop cycles have changed. There's lesser rain in some parts of India and there's more rain in some parts of India, meaning communities that relied on rain-fed agriculture for a very long time now have to switch to irrigated agriculture, which means they need the infrastructure to do that, which means development, which means a lot of things that also cause a lot more climate change. Various other places have seen sort of reduced wildlife, and because of the fact that we're constantly cutting down forests, changing uses of land and expanding our cities, we end up having to create heat islands. It's getting hotter in the city, but the more you go outside, it's getting cooler and cooler. And why is that? Because of the fact that, concrete is just not a good material in the way that it conducts and reflects heat. And it traps heat in urban islands. So we all experience this in very different ways. There are also sort of at the global level, these sustainable development goals that are 17 goals, where for each goal, there are different sort of areas of work that the world needs to focus on. So things around ensuring, from environmental issues of like reducing waste to reducing our emissions to protecting sort of forests, ensuring and conserving water, fresh water especially, all the way to, creating worker well-being, increasing our life in sort of vulnerable communities. Ensuring zero poverty and zero hunger. So these are a sort of wide range of goals. But what most people don't understand or you probably understand it, I should not undermine that. But what most people don't know is that each of these sustainable development goals actually has individual targets within them. And that's where it gets very interesting. So I'm not sure how many of you know about the goals that were before the Sustainable Development Goals. They were called the Millennium Development Goals. And essentially, they were a set of goals that were also focused on sustainable development. But at some point in the last few years, we saw that there was a shift. Suddenly, the Millennium Development Goals started sort of, being played down and they were shut off. And then the Sustainable Development Goals were launched. Not to say that there was not any change that happened when the Millennium Development Goals were in place. Estimates and evidence and reports and studies, etc., suggest that between 2010 and 2015, we did indeed see some significant changes because of the Millennium Development Goals. That's the attribution at least. But We've also seen in the last 5 to 10 years so much more happen. I mean, COVID is a big issue that we all, I think, still face. We might say the pandemic is over, but we indeed have to recognize that it has left an indelible mark on us. We are seeing a lot more people go back into poverty. We're seeing economies go into sort of recession. We're seeing inflation on the rise. We're seeing a lot more sort of production of intense materials and products that use sort of fossil fuels. We are all, I guess, buying cars, buying houses, and a lot of that does have climate impact. And the way that I want you to think about this is that while all of this is happening, and sure, we're all moving towards a better goal for ourselves, the way that we think about it in the context of climate change is that we all have a role to play. Our small actions do have consequences, and that's not to say that we shouldn't do those actions. Right? We should be buying a new car if we want to, but why not think about buying an electric car? You should be thinking about what it means to have an increased amount of disposable income, but why not also think about what that means if you were to donate it to a cause, or if you were to support sort of conservation efforts and deforestation and reduce deforestation around the world. Just in India, for instance, in Madhya Pradesh, there are tribal belts where lots of smallholder farmers exist, and smallholder farmers are folks that have less than sort of 2 hectares of land to themselves. And what we've seen is, because of climate change, they've all been affected because they don't have the kind of resources that they need to support productivity in their land. But there are efforts now by various organizations around the world, and I'm sure that as members of this community, you can also then create opportunities and create projects that could support. So, like I said, everyone does have a role to play, and every action does have a consequence. That right? Because there's sort of 2 ways to think about it. The first is that at a larger global level, climate change is happening. But at a local level, we have what we think are impacts of climate change that we can live with, right? It's hotter, wear looser clothes, turn on your AC, etc. But then you have the consequence of that, which is if you turn on your AC, you're also then contributing to climate change. You're sort of using energy, you're releasing sort of noxious gases and fumes into the environment. And I know it's hard to live without an AC. I can't be sort of saying that, we shouldn't have them. I also use one, but I use it sparingly. I try and see if I can have more plants around me. I try and see if I can work with our local sort of community to stop everybody from turning on the AC all at once, because then when you go out, it gets hotter because ACs also emit heat. And then because, like I said, in concrete jungles, you end up having to retain heat, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. So it's sort of a cycle, and that's something we have to recognize in terms of the consequence. But at the same time, talk around rising sea levels, that climate change is the biggest threat facing humanity, etc. These are all, I call them distant threats, and I call them something that I think is actually not beneficial to us, because the way that we have to think about it is more around how do we play a role in contextualizing climate change and climate action to our own lives. And so if we can take that to go to the next slide. Yeah. So what does it really mean to think about climate change when we contextualize it to our own lives, right? The first and biggest thing is that we need to find better and new language to think and talk about climate change. Because number one, the fact of climate change does not actually have a link to our urban everyday lives is important. And on top of that, if you think about how climate change affects vulnerable communities around the world, farmers, waste work, a bunch of other sort of, people that we see around us that do the hard work that they do, we don't see how climate change affects them, and we don't have the language to talk about it. And the moment we switch that language to say that, instead of saying greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, which is true, but instead of saying that, can we say that greenhouse gas emission increases are causing respiratory disorders for agricultural workers and for, as we call it, gig workers that do a lot of the running around the world, and for taxi drivers and for many others that sort of have to live in these urban environments. Just in the last couple of days, if you've read the news in Delhi, air pollution has increased so much so that, even when I get out, and I'm currently in Delhi, I can't breathe, I have to put on a mask, and I see so many people around that are going about their everyday lives that don't have a choice, right, but to be outside. So if we can start to think about climate change as not a looming threat, as not, oh, this will lead to something later in the future, but it is indeed our reality, we'll be able to change the language we use to talk about it. We'll be able to understand how we can actually think of ways to act and ways to sort of keep moving on climate change. And I think what's needed here is not just us changing our own language, but also a sort of tide change in political thought in terms of narrative, because we need to make ways of dealing with climate change and actually the fallout of climate change more contextual and more tangible to ourselves, right? So for instance, if you think about it, all of these talks around what really, does it mean to be a climate activist, or does planting a tree really work? They might work, but then is that enough from your own space? Is that something that, makes sense for your own local context? Maybe it doesn't. And that's where we need to start sort of peeling the layers off. And to sort of peel those layers off, one of the biggest things beyond language that we need to change is realizing that there's no one solution, right, to fighting climate change. There are many, 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 many solutions. And these can range from big changes where it could be, for instance, switching to a green search engine. I'm not sure how many of you know, but even the internet causes climate change because of server farms and because of the fact that a lot of those create heat, they need cooling. A lot of these are underwater, they cause changes in marine life. And all of these things, we are in some way playing a part, right? But that doesn't mean that you stop using the internet. But what you could do is use a green search engine that relies on servers that use renewable energy or solar energy. And you could also, for instance, then realize that you can also play a part in policy making. Every citizen in every country has a voice, right? And you have to be able to use that voice in your local communities to ask for the things that you think you deserve when it comes to climate change and tackling that climate change. I tried to do this in the pandemic in Bombay when I lived there. And it was a very interesting opportunity to bring young people together to realize that they can actually demand an audience with policymakers that were developing climate action plans for the city of Bombay. And we had dialogues with them. We looked at the different climate action plans. We sort of looked at ways in which young people can actually be part of this process to say they have the lived reality and they need to be the ones in the room when policy decisions are made that will affect them. So realizing that there's many solutions and none of them are perfect, but all of them are necessary is another big change that we need to make. And that's also how we contextualize climate change to our lives. And I think just to sort of also summarize this piece around contextualizing climate change is that everything needs to be solution oriented, right? Because all of this talk about the threat, about the dangers, about what it means when there's cyclones and droughts, we do have to realize that these are all being caused by climate change. We have to understand that there's science behind it. We have to understand that each of us in our own way is affected by climate change. But there are things that we can do about it. And there's, if you think about the sort of big categories of people that exist around the world, so there's young people, there's citizens, there's older people, there's basically us. Then there's citizenry, there's businesses, there's investors, there's governments, policymakers. All of these people have a role to play, and all of these actors have essentially the ability to say that there are solutions out there. And there are. I support a lot of them through my work. I support a lot of them through my engagements with various groups around the world. And the idea is, how do we actually look at these solutions as ways in which we can then start implementing?